From your local election headquarters, an ABC4 News Town Hall Special, America in Crisis, a positive path forward.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this special presentation of ABC4 News. I'm Glenn Mills. Amid the pandemic and protests, we are exploring a positive path forward for an America in crisis. Tonight, we are joined by Utah Senator Mitt Romney. Senator Romney, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for making time for us.
Thanks, Glenn. Good to be with you again.
Good to see you as well. We do want to begin our town hall with this question. Moving forward, how will you help people who have been devastated financially by this pandemic? We've seen millions of Americans lose their jobs. We've seen businesses shut down. What will you do as a senator to help those people get up and working again?
Well, as you know, the first thing that we did already related to the CARES Act, which is having a program, the Paycheck Protection Program, that kept businesses going and people hired. Also, we sent $1,200 per adult, $500 per child to people across the country. Those things were certainly designed to help. And then we increased the unemployment benefit by some $600 a week. So there was a real rescue effort that was undertaken. And I expect that we will have another such effort, which I'm working on right now with other Republican and Democrat senators. We'll probably extend the Paycheck Protection Program. We'll probably extend unemployment insurance. I think we'll look for ways to limit liability that schools, universities, hospitals, and employers will have as a result of people getting COVID-19. We don't want to shut down the economy with lawsuits. And I hope we finally address the amount of debt we're adding and find a way to tackle our debt.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in the next segment. We're going to talk specifically about the debt, but let's stick with economic recovery if we can. Could the economy, in your opinion, go through another shutdown like we have seen in the last couple of months?
I think it's unlikely that there will be calls made by governors. And by the way, they'll be the ones that make the decisions to close down the economy to the extent we did before. I think the reason for that is that when COVID first came to our country, we really didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how contagious it would be, how deadly it would be. The data that we're seeing now shows a couple of important things. One is wearing masks really reduces the spread in a very important way. And number two, the death rate is pretty substantial among older people and people that have health crises of various kinds, but not very significant among younger people. And therefore, going forward, I think it's unlikely we'll shut down the entire economy if there were a spike of some kind. Instead, there'll be a more focused effort to test, contact trace people, and insist that those people that are at greatest risk take the greatest care to keep from getting the disease.
Let's talk a little bit more about the balance between public health and economic health. You kind of dove into it there just now, but there is a balance here, and we're seeing this as a very divisive issue across the country. You know, some are of the mindset, open everything up and, let things play out as they may. Others, we need to continue to shut things down and protect every individual. Where do you see the balance between economic and public health?
Well, now that we have more information as a result of our experience with COVID-19 and the experience of other nations as well, we can see that shutting down the economy does slow the spread of the disease and it saves lives. But it's also extraordinarily disruptive and it creates other kinds of challenges, health challenges as well, as people don't have places to go to work, as they don't have employment opportunities, as kids aren't going to school and so forth. So I think at this stage, given what we know, we will move towards a more targeted effort. And by that, I mean helping businesses that are having a hard time keeping their doors open, keeping employees in jobs, getting rescue funds to people that are out of work, but not closing down the entire economy, allowing older people like myself and people who have health compromised conditions to take special care to be isolated, but letting younger people pretty much go back to the way they were living before. But by the way, masks make a big difference. That's one of the things that we're learning.
We've seen discussion over freedoms being taken away in this situation when we started to see, as you mentioned, states did it on a case-by-case basis. Were you concerned at all about some of the things you were seeing across the country? One example would be a salon owner in Texas who refused to shut down her salon. She went to work, opened it up anyway, and then was thrown in jail. Any concerns there as far as personal freedoms that we saw taken away potentially across the country?
Well, in a health crisis or for that matter, in a war or in an insurgency of some kind, the Constitution allows the government to step in some cases to declare martial law or to take other actions to protect the public. And that's not unusual. It's consistent with our government system, our constitutional system. And I know that many people feel that rights are being infringed. And the answer is yes, those rights are conditional upon our collective adherence to the Constitution and its principles. And if there is a disease which threatens a large number of our people, why, there will be action taken to protect the public health. But as we found out now, the broad shutdown that initially was associated with COVID-19 is probably not going to be essential as we go forward, given the new information we have about the spread of the disease.
All right, Senator, stay with us. We're going to get back to you right after the break. Still ahead, images of hardship all over the country. To pay for the pandemic response, the U.S. government has spent trillions. What it means for the country's financial future and the national debt.
You're watching your local election headquarters. An ABC4 News Town Hall Special, America in Crisis, a positive path forward.
Welcome back to America in Crisis, a positive path forward. The U.S. has spent trillions on the pandemic response and multiple relief packages, but the crisis is not over yet. Should lowering the national debt still be a priority for lawmakers? Utah Senator Mitt Romney joining me once again to discuss what the country's financial future could look like. All right, Senator, we already got into the relief programs. You were one of the first ones calling for that to take place. Why was that?
Well, we had people that were hurting, and we did not want families to not have housing, to not have food, to not have clothing, and so we had to get help to people. That's when you actually do borrow money, is when there's a crisis, when there's an emergency. When you don't want to be borrowing money is when there are normal operations of government and when the economy is strong. In a circumstance like that, you should not be borrowing, and we have been. We've been borrowing about $1 trillion a year, even under Republican leadership, and that, in my opinion, is unacceptable.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little more. 25 trillion and counting. You look at that number and it's hard to even comprehend exactly how much money that is. One of your big campaign promises was that you were a deficit hawk. We talked about that quite a bit. So moving forward, you already mentioned, this is the time to spend when Americans need it, but there are ways to cut. So moving forward, how do you begin to chip away at that deficit?
I've actually introduced a piece of legislation called the Trust Act, which is designed to look at all of our major trust funds, Social Security, disability, Medicare, Medicaid, the Highway Trust Fund, and so forth, and make sure that those are no longer spending massively more than we take in. These will have to be solved on a bipartisan basis. There'll be no change or reduction in benefits to people who are seniors or who rely on these programs today, but younger generations need to understand what the promises are for them. This will help get us to a point where we have a balanced budget and stop borrowing money every single year. The people who buy America's debt are not worried about buying the debt when we're in a crisis like we are now. But if they see us every year continuing the borrowing, they're going to raise interest rates and it could become backbreaking. So we have to tackle this annual deficit, which then adds to the total debt of our country. That's something I'm fighting to get done, and hopefully we'll get this bill passed relatively soon.
As I mentioned, we continue to watch that deficit increase. What type of a time frame? Here at the state level, we see a balanced budget. We don't see that on the national level. What type of time frame do you think is realistic to actually chip away at that huge number?
Well, if we stop adding $1 trillion of new debt every year, why, then the debt that we already have gets to be a smaller and smaller share of our economy. It gets to be less and less significant over the years. But the key thing is to stop adding $1 trillion every single year, even when the economy is strong. And that's where Congress, Republicans and Democrats both have looked the other way and keep spending more than we take in. We spend about $4 trillion a year. We tax about $3 trillion a year. You can't keep doing that even in good times. And that's why my Trust Act is designed to focus on where we spend 2/3 of federal spending. That's on those trust funds, Social Security, disability, Medicare, Medicaid, and the highways.
How much is acceptable to you to continue spending on the current situation for our small businesses and individuals that need it? How much is appropriate in your mind?
Well, we want to make sure that we're being smart. So, for instance, we want to help people that are in crisis. Two, we don't want businesses to close down so that people would lose their jobs. Then neither the businesses nor those people could be paying taxes. So you want to provide sufficient liquidity to keep the economy going. Otherwise, you really start racking up the debt. So what's that sweet spot? I believe it's going to be $1 trillion or less in the next round. I think the Democrats have proposed $3 trillion. I don't think that has any prospect whatsoever of being passed.
Are you satisfied with the PPP program? We've heard from local businesses who have been very frustrated trying to get that money. Do you think it can work more efficiently moving forward?
Well, it's a bit, I joke, it's a bit like the banana stand on Arrested Development with two people standing in line every single day, and then suddenly there are 2,000 people standing in line. So this agency was putting out maybe $40 million a month, and that went overnight to $500 billion. I mean, they were completely overwhelmed. It's up and working pretty well now. A huge majority of the businesses in America with under 500 employees have received funds from the PPP program. Some banks, for instance, I was talking to folks in Cache Valley. They said that the Cache Valley Bank was calling small employers, encouraging them to sign up and get the PPP loan, which they did. It's been a very, very successful program. It has saved a lot of businesses and a lot of jobs as a result of doing so. My guess is we'll continue to expand it in the future.
All right, stay with the Senator. Coming up, a closer look at how the government has responded to the pandemic and how Senator Romney hopes to shape that response going forward. That's next.
You're watching your local election headquarters. An ABC4 News Town Hall Special, America in Crisis, a positive path forward.
Welcome back to our special, America in Crisis, a positive path forward. Senator Mitt Romney back with me now as we shift our discussion to the government's response to this pandemic. Senator Romney, I'd like to get your response or your take on how the government responded. Let's start with the president. How would you rate his job that he has done in responding to this crisis?
Well, you know, the administration did some things well and some things not as well. Part of that, of course, is just at the beginning, there was a great deal of fog. We didn't really know what the COVID-19 crisis was going to look like, how the disease progressed. China dragged its feet on providing us the information we needed. The president was right to close off travel from China and eventually to close it off from Europe as well. The places where the administration, I think, had some failures were in the areas of providing personal protection equipment. It's really unfortunate that we didn't have a bigger stockpile of what was needed to provide face masks and gowns for our healthcare workers, nor did we have a supply chain in our own country to be able to manufacture those things. It also took us way long to start testing our people. And then you may recall the CDC at the very beginning said that wearing masks was not going to be very helpful. Well, it turns out we now think wearing masks is perhaps the most important single thing you can do. Contact tracing, we didn't get going with that until way down the road. So, you know, there were a lot of mistakes, but some things that were done properly. I'm sure there'll be a lot of analysis that is done afterwards to say, how can we do better? And I think the Asians, which had dealt with the SARS epidemic in the past, they were better prepared to know how to respond to a crisis like this, and I think got on top of it faster and more effectively than we did.
What about the states? We saw an array of different responses. Do you believe that's how it should have been handled? Whether one state took it, you know, a completely different way than others, that was the right way to go about it?
Yeah, I think the federal government should have done a more complete job of coordinating the distribution of equipment and supplies than the federal government did. States were competing with each other to buy masks. That doesn't make sense to me. But I think it did make sense to have individual states make their own decisions about what things they'd close down and not close down. In Utah, for instance, Governor Herbert and Lieutenant Governor Cox, I think we're wise to say, look, we're not going to shut down the entire state because we've got some counties that really have no disease whatsoever, and other counties have a lot of it. And so they had more of a piecemeal, county by county, business by business plan, which I think in the long run made more sense.
We opened up this special to questions from our viewers. I want to get to one of those now. This comes from Daniel Whitty. He asks you this, Senator. If a coronavirus vaccine should be developed and approved, there will surely be a large number of people who do not trust it. Do you think it is constitutional to forcibly administer a coronavirus vaccination to those who do not want it?
I think that the public health officials will conclude that this is a vaccine that would be given to people who requested it. It would be voluntarily received. So I don't think that question will ever be raised. I think you're going to find that older people and people who have compromised immune systems will stand in line along with healthcare workers to get it. I think some younger people, particularly children, really won't need it at all because the incidence of the disease and the consequence of the disease is so much less in younger people.
Okay, we only have about 30 seconds left, but I really want to get to this last point. The Navajo Water Rights Settlement. Navajo Nation has been hit disproportionately hard with this virus. How will that potentially help out in this situation?
Well, a piece of legislation that was begun by Senator Orrin Hatch is one that I've picked up, and I have finally got it passed through the Senate. It took unanimous consent, every Democrat, every Republican agreeing. The Navajo Nation gives Utah disputed water rights, and we in the federal government and partially the state give Utah some funding so that we can get water and sewer to the homes of the people of the Navajo Nation. Half of the people in the Navajo Nation in our state don't have running water. That's something we're going to fix.
All right, thank you, Senator. Coming up on America in Crisis, a positive path forward. Senator Romney made headlines after he shared photos of himself marching with Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C. His answer to calls for police reform and the end of racial injustice next.
You're watching your local election headquarters. An ABC4 News Town Hall Special, America in Crisis, a positive path forward.
Welcome back. For weeks, protesters have marched streets all across the country following the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. They're calling for justice in the form of police reform and racial equality. We wrap up our special report tonight with Senator Mitt Romney on that very topic. Senator Romney, it was a pretty striking scene to see you, a Republican senator from Utah, marching in the streets of Washington, D.C. What went into that decision?
Well, I have a very deep concern about making sure that we have equal opportunity for all of our citizens. That's the American way. That's the constitutional requirement. I also have a profound family tradition that relates to standing up for people of all races and backgrounds. And so when people are saying they're going to demonstrate in favor of saving lives and reducing prejudice, well, that's something I can support.
You also did share some photos of your father marching with protesters. He, of course, was a governor of Michigan. Have things changed at all from the same fight he was fighting all the way back then?
Oh, I'm sure the nation has changed in many ways since the 1960s. Some things have gotten better, some things haven't, and some things need to be addressed today that probably weren't being considered then. Right now, I think there's a recognition that in some cases, and it's obviously the small minority of cases, we need to look at policing to make sure that policing is not done in a way that's discriminatory or excessively brutal. And that's something which Congress is looking at, I'm looking at, and I think we'll see some changes in that regard.
Yeah, I want to get into your bill in a sec, but a quick question for you. I do believe there is systemic racism within law enforcement entities across the country.
Well, that term means different things to different people, but is there bias on the part of some individuals? I'm sure that's the case. It would be astonishing with hundreds of thousands of police officers if that were not the case. And I think we're going to look at ways we can try and remove any racism or any use of excessive force that applies to our people.
Yeah, let's get more into that. You're teaming up with South Carolina Senator Tim Scott on that bill. What are you guys hoping to accomplish specifically?
Well, there are a number of things that we'd like to see, and one is we're not going to be mandating, if you will, or creating new federal laws as much as providing grant money or a conditioning grant money that comes to police departments or states based upon having good training, for instance, training that helps police officers understand how to de-escalate a potential conflict. to determine exactly when you should use deadly force and when you should not. Training as well for supervisors to make sure that we have the kind of oversight of police officers that we need. I'm very much in favor also of making sure we have provisions that collect information about when deadly force has been used against minorities, but against others as well, and that we collect that at the federal level to see if there are patterns that are developing there. I also think states should maintain a database of those small number of officers that may have been removed from a police force for having used excessive force, and that information should be available not to the general public, but should be available to other police departments at the time they're doing some hiring. But let me underscore something. That is, the great majority of our law enforcement personnel in Utah, and I believe around the country, are doing an heroic job, are taking a very difficult job and performing it exceptionally well. But there are a few people who need to be called out.
Senator, we have about 1 minute left. Why your GOP plan for police reform as opposed to the Democratic plan that has also been unveiled?
Well, my own view is that our Democrat friends jumped right out without actually talking to law enforcement personnel, without understanding in great depth the kind of challenges the men in blue and women in blue face day to day. And they jumped to make a statement as opposed to make a law. In order to make a law in Washington, you have to get Republicans and Democrats to see if we can come to the same piece of legislation. The Democrats came out with theirs without any collaboration or communication at all with any Republicans, either in the House or in the Senate.
We're doing a job to get them involved. Thanks for being with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.